David Tunick, President of the IFPDA, and we welcome you to this, the fourth and last week of IFPDA Print Month, which coincides with the IFPDA Online Print Fair. If you've tuned in to some of these noontime events, you have an idea of what they have meant for curators, collectors, our IFPDA membership, and the general public. Our executive director, Jenny Gibbs, and her assistant, Sherry Young, have done a remarkable job putting together this huge program day after day, week after week for a full month. It's an immense undertaking, and we all look forward to gathering together in person in one room in the not distant future, we hope, so that Jenny and Sherry can hear our enthusiastic thank yous and applause. Within the Print Month calendar, this is the third and last in a series of a collaboration with the Metropolitan Museum devoted to the prints of the Grosvenor School. Again, our gratitude to Met Director Max Holwein, Met Print Department Head Nadine Orenstein, and especially Jennifer Farrell, the Met's distinguished curator of modern and contemporary prints and illustrated books, who had the initial idea for this symposium. Jennifer has produced a prodigious book on the Grosvenor School entitled Modern Times, British Prints, 1913-1939. It will be officially released tomorrow, but it is already readily available, widely available on the internet and in the Metropolitan Museum bookstore. Jennifer's exhibition of the same name officially opens November 1st, but you heard it here first. You can get into it this coming Friday. I can confidently tell you that you will find the book and the exhibition surprising and enlightening in concept, and astonishing and enlightening in imagery. Of course, there can be no art market without courageous art dealers who take a chance, and today we'll focus on the market for the Grosvenor School. So it is a special pleasure to have two such courageous and visionary dealers with us, the great Gordon Samuels from London, who has done so much for the Grosvenor School artists throughout his long career, and Mary Ryan, who in a very real sense introduced the Grosvenor School to the United States. It is no less a pleasure to have with us the legendary Leslie Garfield, who was the first collector anywhere to purchase Grosvenor School prints in vast numbers. He recognized their importance and acted on it. More than 700 of the Garfield's vast collection of Grosvenor School works of art on paper were acquired by the Met fairly recently, and they exclusively make up what Jennifer will be exhibiting in the aforementioned and upcoming show at the Met. For those of you who may not have been with us the last 2 Mondays, I can sum up what I've already said about Jennifer in repeating that she is supremely accomplished in her academic bona fides and in her extensive achievements at a broad range of museums in this country, ranging from Yale and Smith to the Met, the Morgan, and MoMA. When today's talks and conversation conclude, and if there is time, our speakers will answer as many of your questions as we can get to. If you take your cursor down to the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A button, not the chat button, the Q&A button, you'll be able to use your keyboard to type in whatever it is you wish to ask. With that, I turn it over to Metropolitan Curator and Authority on the Grosvenor School, Jennifer Farrell.
Thanks, David, for that lovely introduction. I kind of feel like I should stop right now. Anyway, I want to welcome you, as David did, to our third installment of The Art of Today, Grosvenor School Linocuts and Their Legacy, a symposium on the occasion of Modern Times British Prints, 1913 to 1939, which, as David mentioned, will be opening at the Met later this week. I am beyond thrilled to introduce our esteemed panel today of Gordon Samuel, Mary Ryan, and Leslie Garfield. I will briefly go into just a snapshot of their many accomplishments so that we can jump to their fascinating discussion. Gordon Samuel co-founded the Osborne Samuel Gallery in 2004 with Peter Osborne. Previously, he directed the gallery Samuel and Company and was director at the Red Fern Gallery and Mercury Gallery. Osborne Samuel Gallery is one of London's leading specialists in modern British painting and sculpture and is well known for its exhibition of post-war British painters and sculptors, including Henry Moore, whose work is on view right now. The gallery also specializes in rare British 20th century prints, including the Linocuts of the Grosvenor School. Recently, they have shown the complete prints of C.R.W. Nevinson, Cyril Power, and Sybil Andrews. And in 2019, Gordon curated Cutting Edge, Modernist British Printmaking, the most extensive museum exhibition of British modernist prints at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, and I believe in the UK. And in November this year, November 18th, Gordon will open the show Sybil and Cyril, Cutting Through Time, which will be on view in London through early December. Following Gordon will be Mary Ryan. Mary Ryan is the founder and owner of the Mary Ryan Gallery in New York City. The gallery will be celebrating its 40th anniversary this coming November, which is in a week, and has continuously been open to the public since its founding in New York City in 1981. Known for its expertise, original scholarship, and longstanding commitment to modern and post-war contemporary prints and works on paper, the gallery prides itself on being a place of discovery, as it is constantly striving to expand its knowledge and support of new artists and fields. The gallery has organized over 200 solo and group exhibitions throughout its years of activity and has published numerous catalogs that have generated and continue to further important artistic legacies. And as we will hear today, Mary was absolutely instrumental in introducing the Grosvenor School work to many in North America and indeed around the world. Finally, we will have a discussion with Leslie Garfield. Over 6 decades, Leslie and Joanna Garfield acquired one of the most comprehensive and important collection of 20th century prints. The collection they built, which numbers well over 6,000 works, features a rich selection of prints by German expressionist artists, American Provincetown printmakers, British modernists, including, of course, the Grosvenor School artists, and post-war figures such as Jasper Johns, David Hockney, Richard Hamilton, and Dieter Roth. Leslie is the founder of the Leslie J. Garfield and Company Real Estate Company and is also a major philanthropist. Along with his late wife, Joanna, he supported the Youth Symphony Orchestra, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Chazen Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art, among others, in addition to the International Print Center and the IFPDA. With that, I turn the microphone and camera over to Gordon Samuel, who will present a fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Jennifer. Just waiting to get the first slide up. Good afternoon from the UK. Here you see the actual building, which is the Grosvenor School of Modern Art. It was commissioned by a Scottish portraitist called James Ranney Swinton. And it's one of the finest and one of the first purpose-built gallery studio houses in London. It's housed in the Pimlico district of London, which is just behind London's Victoria Station. Can we go on to the next? Shari, can we go on to the next slide? Now you see the interior of the building, and on the left is the life class, and the model there is one of the linocutters of the Grosvenor School, Eileen Mayo, who was brought up in Britain and then went to New Zealand eventually. Then on the right, you see one of the rooms in the basement of the Grosvenor School itself, 33 Warwick Square, and it's the lithographic studio, and you can see there, one of the large lithographic stones actually leaning on the side there. We go to the next one. Now here on the right is the advertisement that used to appear in the studio magazines. And there you can see the advertisement for the Grosvenor School of Modern Art. Now, this advertisement attracted students to the Grosvenor School, and certainly the Australians, who was Ethel Spowers and Evelyn Syme and Dorrit Black. Now, on the left-hand side is part of the prospectus for the Grosvenor School. And we always think of Flight as being there at the Grosvenor School. He started there actually in 1926. And as it says, he was teaching block printing. And surprisingly, it was just for 2 hours every Tuesday afternoon. And of course, Cyril Power was a student of his, and so was Sybil Andrews. And you can see there, I don't know how clear it is on your computers, but it's 3 guineas, £3, 3 shillings, which today translates to £3.15. And £3.15, I looked it up on the internet just to see what it's worth today. And it's about £190 or about $250 today. And so you bought, it was a very informal school, so you didn't need any examinations to get in. You simply bought a carnet, a book of tickets, and you just sat in on his classes on Tuesday afternoons. And of course, Sybil Andrews also started there, and she was the school secretary at the time. Okay, let's go on to the next one. And here is the man himself. This is Claude Flight at work, and lifting the very, very thin paper that he recommended that was used to make these Linocuts. It's a very, very thin mulberry tissue paper. I've always maintained that the reason he used it is because the inks that were applied to the block and then to the paper didn't absorb into the paper the way it would absorb into an arch paper or reeve paper, but it dried on the surface. And as you can see, there was no machine involved in making them. These were hand printed in editions of about 50 or 60. And the ink was transferred to the paper by rubbing the back of the paper with a spoon or a burin. And that's how it was applied. Right, let's go to the next one. Now, Flight he started at Heathersley School of Art when he was 31. He had a checkered career as a pig farmer. He lived next door to Rudyard Kipling in Kent. He then went off to war. But before that, in 1912, he joined Heathersley School of Art. And at the time, Nevinson was there too. But we'll come on to that in a moment. Now, I put this oil painting in because, it is the only oil painting or any work I have seen apart from Flight's Linocuts, which are in any way modernist. This is the only one in my entire career that I've seen. When I first saw the work many, many years ago, I met his daughter, Anne, at her house in Kent, and she had lots of watercolors that she said, would I be interested? And quite honestly, I wasn't, because they were very, very traditional watercolors of landscapes. But it surprised me seeing this one painting of a swimmer. Now, on the left-hand side is what is considered to be the seminal work of the whole Grosvenor School. This is Claude Flight and his famous print of Brooklands, where the car's actually going around the track the wrong way, because when you print, it's in reverse. Made in 1929, and it was the year that the first exhibition of British Linocuts was shown at the Redfern Gallery. And Flight joined the Grosvenor School in 1926 and attracted students, as I said, from Australia and Lil Shudi from Switzerland too, all via those advertisements that you saw earlier. Let's go on to the next one. Now, he left his wife, Claire, in the late teens, and he met Edith Lawrence in 1920. And then she moved into his studio in 1925. And they began a design company. And you can see some of the designs here, which were the cushions, the footstool, the screen behind, and they made textiles, and they you know, it was this modernist ethos that they tried to convey. Let's go on to the next one. Now, this was my old boss. This is Sirex Nancobel, born Reginald Nancobel. Nancobel is a Cornish name in the southwest corner of England. It's a county there. And he left New Zealand as a boy soldier in 1916, I think, came to London. And when he landed in London, he became Rex Nancobel. And he was I adored him. He was a wonderful man. And he joined the Redfern, I think about 1926. When he was demobbed from the army, he had met a woman called Fanny Hulbert. I think he was sort of stationed with her. And I think she was quite a rich woman, and she funded him to buy into the Redfern, which he did. And by late 1920s, he was running it. And there was another partner called Nivet Lee. And I didn't realize until I'd read Jenny Hublow's new book that will be coming out next month, that it was actually Nivet Lee who first discovered the Grosvenor prints and Claude Flight, and then handed it over to Rex. And Rex was the one who put together that first exhibition in 1929 and subsequent exhibitions as well. Now, he was a lovable rogue. He was not very good at paying his artist. And he had a falling out with Claude Flight around 1932, 33, I think. And Flight moved the whole Grosvenor School exhibitions to the Ward Gallery, which was then in Baker Street. And but Sybil Andrews and Power continued with Redfern and with Rex. He also, let's go on to the next one. Now actually, let's go to the one after this, because this is the second page. Now, this is the catalogue for the first exhibition of British Linocuts at the Redfern in 1929, which is incidentally where I started my career in 1970. And you can see on the left-hand side the prices of them. A Godia Brzeska was included. And you can see the tube staircase by Cyril Power, which is 3.5 guineas. I can't think what that is, but £3 and 4 shillings or something like that. Dorrit Black's at £2. So that was, I mean, no illustrations because it was so expensive, but it was a hugely successful show, and it traveled to various locations in the UK, up as far as Newcastle in the north of England. And it attracted about 12,000 visitors, I think, on this tour. During that time, it was seen by Mr. and Mrs. Pennant, who were back on leave from Hong Kong, and approached Flight, and actually the show went to Shanghai. And there are various articles in the South China News about the exhibition there. What's the next slide, Shari? This, to me, is one of the great prints of the whole movement. It's Cyril Power's The Tube Station. Here you have commuters on the London Underground, which we call the Tube, and they are on their way to work. You can see the men in their top hats and probably the ladies with their cloches on. But interesting to see that they're all reading their newspapers, very, very British, where they are very, very reserved. And I suppose if you think in 2021, there wouldn't be newspapers, they'd all be looking at their phones. But I think this is one of the great prints. Let's go on to the next one. And on the left, I think, is Sybil Andrews' most important print of Speedway. Now, Speedway was introduced to Britain, I think, about 1928. And at Wembley Stadium, which still is rebuilt, but in 1923 it was built, and they have soccer matches, or what we call football matches there, and up to 100 to 200,000 people would go. And they had dirt track racing there, or speedway racing, from the 30s right through to the 60s. And this was her seminal print, and it adorned the cover of Stephen Koppel's book of Linocuts of the Machine Age, Claude Flight and His Followers, which was published in 1995. Now, on the right is Sybil's other great print of racing. Now, this was also used as a poster that Sybil and Cyril did under the composite name of Andrew Power. And they made posters for the London Underground, commissioned by the sort of doyen of design during the 30s for the London Underground, called Frank Pick. Now, the horses actually are going round the Epsom racecourse, where the Epsom Derby is held every June. And this last bend is known as Tatman Corner. And you can see the dynamism, the speed and the energy of the horses as they round the corner, coming up to the final straight, which is, I don't know whether you, in America, you think of furlongs, but maybe it's half a mile to the finish. And so that's the subject of that. It's a wonderful image. You can see the fence on the left-hand side there in the foreground. And the next one, please. This is interesting. The one on the right, as you see, is by C.R.W. Nevinson, called Nerves of an Army. And it was the communications of these guys up on a telegraph pole fixing wires, which is the same as Lil Shudy's subject. In fact, this print by Nevinson, which no doubt is probably at the Met exhibition, was bought by the film director, Richard Attenborough, who told me that this was one of his first purchases. And he recreated this in his great epic film called Oh, What a Lovely War. But on the right is Lil Shudy, her depiction of the same subject. And these are probably in Switzerland or in Paris when she was there. And I love the way the lines are just incised through the lino there and left white. It's a really, really dramatic subject, and certainly her best print. And the next one, please. This is one of the least known of the Grosvenor School artists, William Greengrass. He joined the Royal Engineers in 1911. And in 1915, during the First World War, he was in the first Battle of Ypres. And he volunteered to lay cables, I think, at the front. And he was shot in the foot. And he remained in no man's land for a few days, and gangrene set in, and he had to have his leg amputated. When the war was over, he became a keeper at the Victoria and Albert Museum and met Claude Flight. We don't know how, but Flight invited him to join his classes at the Grosvenor School, which he did, and included him in both of his books that he wrote in 1927 and 1934, on the art of lino cutting. Very, very good artist, very little known, and very difficult to find them. Next one. And this was Claude's partner, Edith. And this is a cricket match taking place on the left. Now, it's you would think that it's a sort of quintessential English game on a Sunday afternoon, but I think here she's used the lino cut to great effect, cutting quite bold shapes. The cricket is played in white clothing, white shirts and white trousers. And so the white is what's left after the inking, and I think she's done it superbly well. She's got the perspective quite right too. Now the French cafe on the right seems a bit ambiguous because the flags aren't French, they look Belgian to me. And you can see probably a priest there just about to have his coffee. But Edith was at the Slade School of Art, which was one of the great art schools of London. And she was there from 1910 until 1914. She won various prizes. She came from quite an affluent family. Her father, I think his last name was Adams, the family owned Jackson's of Piccadilly, which was a very, very famous shop on Piccadilly, specializing in teas. But during her period at the Slade School of Art, where she won many prizes, it was that period that I think was referred to as a crisis of brilliance by Henry Tonks, who was the senior lecturer there. And during that crisis of brilliance, it included Edward Wadsworth, included Mark Gertler, Stanley Spencer, C.R.W. Nevinson, the actual cream of modernism back in that time. Right, next one, please. Now this is Leonard Beaumont, who came from a suburb of Sheffield in Yorkshire in the north of England. And he was a graphic designer. He was a very, very successful printmaker, especially in etchings. And he came down to London in 1929 and he saw Flight's journal, his books, you know, the 27 and the 34 book on lino cutting. And he saw that there was an exhibition in the summer of 1929. He came down to London and saw the exhibition, met Flight, and Flight invited him to try out lino cutting, which he did, as you can see, very, very successfully, in much paler shades. But he was the only artist associated with the Grosvenor School who didn't actually go to the Grosvenor School. Very interesting man. And there is a catalogue resume that was published about 4 or 5 years ago in his work. And the next one. Right. The lino cut, let's go to the next page. The lino cut demise was really towards the end of the 30s with the war coming on. Interest waned a lot. But in 1973, my old friend here, Michael Parkin, was approached by the family of Edith Lawrence, asking whether he would consider having a show of hers. So he went to see her in Dorset, I think it was, and he had a show of hers. And she introduced him to the work of Claude Flight as well. Now, I remember Michael telling me at one stage he had 32 copies of Brooklands, which if I had now, I could probably sell for 6 figures, pounds, 6 figures. He was a great entertainer. He was a great personality, as you can see, outside of his gallery in London in Motcombe Street, and the picture below with Francis Bacon. Michael began his career in television, but before that, as a part of the team of a pirate radio ship that broadcast 50 miles outside of the British waters, so they could not be prosecuted. And it was pop music because we didn't have pop stations in the early 60s, and Michael was you know, at the forefront of it. But he started this gallery in Motcombe Street, and he showed a plethora of people. He went on to travel to Campbell River, where he met Sybil Andrews, and brought shows back. And he was the one that really began the renaissance, the revival of the market for Linocuts. Let's go on to the next slide. And here he is. I mean, he organized exhibitions, this one in Italy, and the next one. Now, this is interesting. It is the white plan chest underneath the stairs at the Redfern Gallery, and how I really got interested in Linocuts. Michael had started this in 1973 with this show of Edith Lawrence. Edith died shortly after the show closed, and Michael became her artistic executor. And so he had all the flights, all Edith Lawrence's, and I was clearing out these drawers early in the 1980s. They were junk drawers. Everything was just thrown in there. So we actually closed for 2 weeks. I got 2 trestle tables, and there were no you know, computers in those days. I had a template made, and with, you know, name, artist, medium, size, paper size, all that sort of thing, and I filled them all in. And in that drawer, I found I think maybe 10 Linocuts, and they were Cyril Power's the tube train that you saw earlier. And I put them on in a show. So let's go to the next slide. And this was the catalogue. And number 80, if I look very carefully, was £1,200, about $2,000, I guess, in those days. And you can see the print on the right-hand side. So I put this show up, and it was, the print was hanging on the wall. And there was an elderly gentleman looking at the print. And I thought I'd better get up and go and talk to him. So I walked over, and I started explaining all about the Linocut process and about Cyril Power and who he was. And the gentleman turned to me, smiled, and said, "Yes, I know all about it. He was my father." And I said, "Gosh." And then I asked him where he lived. He told me he lived in Oxford, and he was a retired bank manager. And the inevitable question, "Do you have any Linocuts?" "Well, I've got a few." So I said, "Well, I'm going to be in Oxford next week. Can I come and have a look?" So I did, and weaved my way into his home. And I bought 6, and he gave me masses of newspaper clippings, which I photocopied and sent to Stephen Koppel, who was at the Australian National Gallery and preparing his book on the Linocuts. And he then introduced me to his brother, who was the youngest of the Power sons, Kit. And I worked with Kit for many, many years. And let's go to the next one. This was the first major exhibition of Linocuts since 1929. I mean, it surpasses, I'm proud to say, all of Michael's exhibitions. And there was an extensive essay and research that I did for this. And there were something like 105 prints, and I think I sold practically all of them in 1985. Let's go on to the next one, because where Michael was dealing with the artists, with Sybil and with Cyril, and picking up things from Edith Lawrence, and it was rather like if you had somebody in a supermarket aisle that said, "You can have whatever you want," and their hands came out and everything was put into a supermarket trolley. And the things that were left on the floor, that's what I did. I went round and I picked them up. And Kit introduced me to his cousin Vonnie, who lived in Essex. And Vonnie had 6 prints on top of a closet, which I bought. And then he introduced me to a nurse who lived in the Kent seaside town of Hastings. And I bought from her. So that's how I began. And then Mary and I met in New York, and we were both exhibiting at the Works on Paper Fair. And from the Works on Paper Fair, it evolved into the IFPDA. And I showed Linocuts in every major print fair that I did since then. So I could go on forever, but I thought this last quote by Kazimierz Malevich, I think encapsulates the whole of what this movement was about. In art, this state is called dynamic movement. So I will hand you over to my friend and colleague, Mary Ryan, and let her continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. That was great. And I want to thank Jennifer and Matt and the IFPDA for putting together this program. I'm going to talk about my interest in Grosvenor School Linocuts and Sybil Andrews in particular, and how that came about. It came about because of a chance encounter. And I was thinking about Marcel Juist's talk last Monday. He mentioned how Lil Schutte had seen a Norbertine Bressler Roth print and how that changed her life and encouraged her to become a printmaker. Now here we see 2 extraordinary wood engravings by Claire Layton. Layton was not a member of the Grosvenor School, but she was my gateway to British Linocuts and to Sybil Andrews in particular. Layton was born in London in 1898. She was impacted in so many ways by World War I, and she emigrated to the United States in 1939 at the age of 41. She needed a fresh start and a new life. Ultimately, she settled in Waterbury, Connecticut, and lived there until her death at age 91 in 1989. So here we see these 2 extraordinary prints that she made after a trip to Canada in 1931. She called these the Canadian Lumber Camp series. I think that Layton blew open the idea of what a wood engraving could be. I knew Claire Layton, and I was fortunate to deal in her prints. I visited her in her studio in Connecticut in the early 1980s. And at that time, these wood engravings would have been in the $300 price range. Today, I'd put these in the $3,000 range if they were to be available. Next picture, please. And now back to Sybil Andrews and the Grosvenor School. Here I'm showing you Sybil Andrews' Fall of the Leaf. It's going to be a backdrop for my discussion as to how I came about learning about Sybil. I think this is an absolutely spectacular linocut. I agree with Gordon on his kind of greatest hits and the prints that we tend to see as these superb examples by each artist that he highlighted. But I think there's so much to still be discovered. And I personally feel that Fall of the Leaf is up there with racing. Now, my chance encounter with Sybil Andrews came from the art critic, Kenneth Baker. I met him when he was an art critic for the Boston Phoenix. And he went on to become the chief art critic for the San Francisco Chronicle. Now, in the early 80s, he visited my gallery after having been to London. He had seen Claire Layton's that I had and knew how much I liked her work. He had seen an Andrews print at the Victoria and Albert Museum and made note of it and came in to tell me that he thought if I liked Layton, I would really like Sybil Andrews. So I had never heard of her, but I was really intrigued and I started to look into her work. And by 1983, I was representing Sybil Andrews in the United States. When you look at this print, I think it's easy to see that many of the same qualities that attracted me to Claire Layton ring true for Sybil Andrews. Because of my interest and background in American printmaking, I was used to the subject matter of the landscape, cityscape in the more or less mannered prints by artists like Grant Wood, Louis Lozowick, and Thomas Hart Benton. They focused on the laborer and the land or the cityscape. And Louis Lozowick, with his great precisionist city images, also in black and white, also in lithography, made me think a bit of Sybil Andrews too. But I had never seen prints from this era, rendered with the kind of dynamism and the extraordinary color that I saw in the prints of Sybil Andrews. Now, in this print called Fall of the Leaf, you see the furrows of the turned over earth, the colors of autumn, and the repeated lines that echo the shapes that repeat as well. I think that her own labor in carving and almost burrowing out the linocut block is echoed in the lines of her cutting, whether she's trying to show us plowed earth or the tracks of a speedway or a horse race. So after discovering these Grosvenor School prints, I felt they were a game changer for me. And I felt that these works should be much better known. And I realized that I really hadn't seen it in the United States. So my role as a dealer in helping Sybil Andrews was to really place her art in museums so that she would become better known and to develop a strong collector base. And as a dealer, most importantly with living artists, is to sell their prints to be able to support them. She really needed income from sales of her prints. And I was able to make that happen for her. Next picture, please. Here you're looking at two prints, same print, one unframed and one framed, both called Coffee Bar by Sybil Andrews. 1952, she's living in Canada now, and she's having fun with the plaid pattern of the Canadian lumberjacks, lined up for their morning coffee with their cubist-shaped buttocks. I'm showing this unmatted and framed because I wanted to let you know about how Sybil preferred that her work be seen. You'll notice in the print on my right that you see all of the messy edges from where she lined up the blocks to register, and there'd be the residual ink that remained in the margins. She never wanted this to be seen. She specified when I exhibited her work that the mat be tightly cropped and very carefully cover those messy edges. For that reason, she signed her prints within the image so that you could see her signature, but she wanted these seen as crisp and finished. Over time, many museums and collectors now show these prints with the edges exposed. And I find that interesting because it shows her process. But I personally prefer to see them matted because I know that's what the artist wanted. Next slide, please. Here's a print of Andrews called The New Cable. Now in 1982, I traveled to London. I followed up on Ken Baker's suggestion. I looked at prints by Andrews and other Grosvenor School artists in the print study room of the Victoria and Albert Museum. I recall being told that the V&A had at some point loaned Linocuts out from their collection for people to hang in their homes. So I was disappointed to see that most of their impressions seemed faded to me. But on that same trip, I visited Michael Parkin Gallery, was able to see a lot of Linocuts and beautiful impressions. And I bought a large group of prints from Michael by Andrews and Powers and many of the other Grosvenor School artists. I was starting to put together a group and I intended to show them at some point in New York City. Michael Parkin seemed very surprised to have interest in these prints from a young woman art dealer from America, but he was helpful and sold them to me. I began to further research Sybil Andrews and learned about the curator Peter White from Canada. He had prepared an excellent catalog raisonné of her prints. It accompanied a show at the Glenbow Museum in Alberta, Canada. She had given the museum over 500 works of art. That catalog is really important and I think kicked off all of the subsequent interest in Andrews' work. It's quickly sold out in Canada, the catalog, and I was only able to get a copy of it after I started a correspondence with Sybil Andrews. So it was not until 1983 that I was able to first really read about her in this catalog and then see kind of the breadth of all of her prints as they were represented. Now, Andrews has equal appreciation in her work for the worker, whether it be an urban worker or a rural worker. She's interested in machinery, rhythm, movement. And I feel that this is one of the largest prints that she made called the New Line Cable. It's also called just the New Cable. Sometimes you'll see it with a blue background, but she ended up eliminating it because she felt the distilled force of just the figures against white was the strongest presentation of the print. Next picture, please. Now here's one of the Andrews Power collaborations for the London Underground that Gordon had mentioned these posters. This is a cricket scene referred to as Lord's Oval. Now the poster is signed, it's printed signature that says Andrew Power. They used a pseudonym indicating that they made these posters together. You'll see though that when we discovered the drawing for this particular print, the drawing study of the cricket player, that it is signed by Sybil herself, very clearly just signed Sybil Andrews. So she's stating that she's the artist that made the image for this poster. Next picture, please. I was lucky enough to enjoy correspondence with Sybil Andrews. And I'll read a few excerpts from her letters. It's a little difficult for you to, I think, interpret yourself on the screen. This one is from August 20th, 1983. Dear Mary, it's good to know that you've enjoyed my Linocut prints and think of including me in your forthcoming group show of women printmakers. To tell you the truth, I have always avoided like the plague, all women only exhibitions, very greatly disliking the male versus female competition. I always think of a letter I received from a man in California who admired my prints and praised them and spoiled all he had said by his last remark. So strong for a woman. Poor weak women. Some of the first editions are getting low or are quite out. The blocks are in fine condition. I see no reason why there should not be a US edition. Of the list you mentioned for the group exhibition, concert hall, 1 or 2 proofs remain. Blocks gone for concert hall, theater, steeplechasing, and timber gym. But I could let you have my own copies, the last of all, for exhibition if you so desired. The ones on the list are okay. First edition is exhausted, but blocks in good condition for tiller of the soil, fall of the leaf, skaters, gale, and plowing pasture. I did take her up on her offer so that I would be able to have a complete retrospective showing one of every print she had made up to that point in 1983. That was her first exhibition in the United States. It was a huge success, and I was really happy to report back to her that the Metropolitan Museum bought her impression of concert hall. That was the first museum to buy her work from me. On the right, you see the gallery announcement, which is a postcard, announcing this retrospective. And in small print at the bottom, you can note that we were also showing a selection of drawings by Layton at the same time. Next slide. Over the course of her life, Andrews made 79 linocuts. Of these, half were made between 1929 and 1939. Winch's one, made in 1930 when she was in London. The works from the period when she was living in the UK tend to be the ones that have more industrialized images of labor. Now, Andrews was born in 1898 in Bury St. Edmunds, Suffolk, England. She emigrated to Canada in 1947 when she was 49 years old. She had been through 2 world wars. She wanted a new life and a fresh start. She had married Walter Morgan when she was 45, and together they settled in Campbell River on the northern part of Vancouver Island, a very remote fishing and logging village. Sybil Andrews met Walter Morgan during the Second World War. He was a shipbuilder and had only one arm, as he had lost his arm in an accident during World War I. Next slide. Here we see Sybil Andrews' skaters made in Canada. She's, of course, interested in ice skating because now she is in Canada. And you see how the forceful arcs in the background echo the shape of the ice skates. I think it's a fantastic print. Now, of the 79 prints that Andrews made during her life, 10 are images of the Stations of the Cross. I don't have a picture in this presentation, but perhaps you have seen them. I asked Andrews about the subject matter because 10 is quite a number of prints. And because of the religious subject matter, I wondered how that factored into her life. She told me that she was interested in the drama of the subject, not especially any religious aspects of that imagery. But I learned that Andrews was a Christian Scientist. She subscribed to the Christian Science Monitor newspaper. That was her main source of news, and that's where she read her reviews of art, literature, and music. She and Walter papered the walls in her house with old copies of the Christian Science Monitor. When I first visited her in Campbell River and noticed the presence of the newspaper, I returned to New York and called the art critic Ted Wolfe, who wrote for the Christian Science Monitor. I knew Ted as he had been interested in prints, and he was a highly regarded art critic who had won a Pulitzer Prize for his art criticism. I showed him Sybil's prints and asked that he write about her, and he did. So he wrote about Sybil and published that article in the Christian Science Monitor, and that meant that was a great, great deal for Sybil. Now, talking about the market for Sybil Andrews' prints. For the very first time I exhibited her Linocuts, I found an eager audience. The first great collectors of her prints were my existing US collectors for American prints. Beth and Jim DeWitty were among the first to put together a linocut collection, and they hung the pictures salon style on one wall. Now, in the 80s, as Gordon mentioned, we didn't have computers or fax machines or the internet, of course, and there weren't art fairs yet either. So the way that I was able to get museums interested in Sybyl's work was through my own outreach. I would send letters to curators at museums, primarily in the US, to introduce them to her work and include biographical information and slides of selected images. Then I'd follow up with an in-person appointment and travel with a portfolio of prints to show them to the museums, hoping to sell them. Through this outreach, I was able to sell many of the Grosvenor School artists to museums in the US, including in California, the Midwest, New York, Boston, London, and also even to Australia. David Keel was the first curator to see the exhibition and recommend her work for museum purchase. And I remember meeting with Reva Castleman at MoMA. I had brought prints to show her as well. This was in the early 80s, and she selected one of Sybil Andrews' later prints called Tracts, which was one of her most abstract. At that time, I think the print was about $300. Many years later, MoMA acquired Sybil Andrews' Racing and Powers, the 8, their iconic works, at a cost then of about $50,000 each. I certainly noticed that as values increased, the prints attracted more attention, and the market for their work started attracting a different type of collector. Now, increased values on these prints continued, and they waxed and waned over the years. Some of this has to do with fluctuating prices in value of currency. For example, at a certain point when I was dealing in these prints, the US dollar to pound ratio was almost at parity. And in 2008, I think the cost of the US dollar to the pound was $2.08 to 1 pound. So when you're looking at histories of pricing, it's interesting to keep in mind what the US currency values were compared to those in the UK. The market for most of these prints has primarily been in the United States and in the UK, with a market in Australia too. Now, I met Stephen Koppel in Australia in 1987 and learned about his research on linocuts. His Linocuts, the Machine Age, is still the Bible of Grosvenor School prints. I think it's exciting that new art historians like Jenny Uglow are continuing the work, and Hannah Leeper, because I think there's so much more to be done. Next slide. I like this slide because it shows that Sybil was alive long enough to see that her art was truly appreciated by museums and collectors. It's dated January 12, 1985. It says Christmas Eve came a special carrier with a packet to be signed, for it was from the Library of Congress, Washington, DC, enclosing a copy of their 1985 Library of Congress magazine and a request for permission to reproduce my linocut oranges in the next 1986 edition of the magazine. That was a good Christmas mail and is thanks to your work. Blessings and all the best for 1985. Love from Sybil Andrews. Next slide. Here's a price list from 1985. I was thinking, this is the same year that Gordon did the big show in London. This is a group exhibition of Grosvenor School prints. You can notice that I've written out of date across the top to make sure no one at the gallery by mistake sold a print in later years for these prices. Now, at the time of 1985, the prices ranged from $600 to $5,000 for Sybil Andrews prints. And for Lil Shooty, $700 for her black and white ski weekend, up to $1,500 for tour de force and jazz orchestra. Next slide. This is another excerpt from Sybil Andrews. She sent to me this in 1989. She was 91 years old. You can see this one you actually can read because I've typed it out. You can see that she was teaching a weekly class and deeply connected to nature and to birds, especially. When I first met her in person, I thought about how it must have been for her to have left England after having been in the center of an art scene in London. What a great contrast to her life in Canada. During the time that she was with Claude Flight and Cyril Power, she encountered Vorticism, Cubism, Futurism. Sybil Andrews wrote that we were the avant-garde in those days. Contrast that with living in a very remote area without access to other artists, classical music, and museums at anywhere near the scale she had experienced in London. And for decades after she arrived in Canada, there were little to no sales of her Linocuts from the 1940s through most of the 1970s. She taught weekly classes in art and music to locals on Vancouver Island, right up to the time of her death. That is really what sustained her financially. Next picture, please. This is a picture of Sybil Andrews' studio and home, February 5th, 1989. I thankfully took a few Polaroids during that trip. Now, I first visited Sybil Andrews in 1983. My husband drove across Vancouver Island with me, and we spent a day with Sybil and her husband, Walter Morgan. At that time, Walter was not doing well physically and had signs of dementia. They lived in a small house that they had built together. It was oceanfront and very rugged. Sybil told me that when she first arrived in Campbell River, they were completely self-sufficient. Over time, some big stores and fast food restaurants popped up around them, and they were glad for that as it made life easier. They were able to walk to a place where they could buy food, for example. Next, here's a picture of Sybil during that visit. Her home and studio were one and the same, surrounded by books, surrounded by music. Behind her on the shelf, you'll see one of her paintings. She did a number of oil paintings in the 30s as well. And there she is on the right outside. And here is Sybil with her, she called them her printing spoons. So she was, showing me her process at that point as to how she made prints. Next. This is the gallery's second complete retrospective of Andrews' work. We showed every print she made up until 1992, and she died a month after that exhibition closed in December 1992 at the age of 94. Next. This is the next gallery selected exhibition of work by Sybil Andrews. You can see from this price list that the Canadian subjects from the 1970s were selling for lower prices than the prints that she made in the 20s and 30s. That pecking order of pricing and desirability remains the same today, with the earlier works being the most desired and with some exceptions the most valuable. Next picture. Now we come to Lil Schutte. I'll discuss her very briefly. I love this print by Lil Schutte. This is a fantastic tour de Suisse. And then next, please go back to tour de Suisse, sorry. I love this print as well as the Black and White Jazz Band Orchestra, these two long horizontal format, black and white rhythmic prints. In 1985, I sold these prints for $500 each. And at the market high point in 2008, they were selling for about $35,000 each. Next. I met Lil Schutte through a collector friend named Alan Melnicker. He collected American WPA prints, and he had an interest in the humorous prints of Peggy Deacon, as do I. Alan spent each summer living in Switzerland and hiking every day. He had seen Sybil Andrews' prints at my gallery, and when hiking in Switzerland, he met Lil Schutte. He knew her work vaguely. I knew Lil's work vaguely from what I had seen in London, but it was through Alan that I got to know her and to know her work. I wrote to Lil and traveled to Switzerland to meet her. She lived in Schwanden, a small town in the province of Sauerland, Switzerland. She lived with her sister in a house that Lil told me had been in their family for over 400 years. Lil's sister made us what she said was a classic lunch. We spent the day with her. It was like a soup of cream and veal. Lil showed me portfolios of prints that she had made, and we went through hundreds and hundreds of prints. And I selected impressions to bring back for an exhibition in New York. That was the first show of Lil Schutte's work in New York and the first of many that we had for the artists, although many of the exhibitions were group shows. So here you see London buses and pass roads. So I'm closing this portion of my talk with two of my favorite Lil Schutte's prints, the London buses from 1949 and pass roads from 1952. I think they both have such energy and movement and hustle and bustle. In 1985, these prints were selling for $1,200 and $1,500. At the market high point, Lil Schutte's London buses would sell for about $50,000. And a good impression, I think, would still sell in that price range today. Now, in conclusion, I have been an art dealer for 40 years, and one of my greatest pleasures is sharing art discoveries with fellow art dealers, collectors, and curators. For me, the people along the way have been just as important as the art. We've formed deep friendships rooted in our shared interests in these artists. So today I feel especially lucky to be on a talk with my friend Gordon Samuel and with Jennifer Farrell, who's done such a fantastic job championing these artists. And of course, last but not least is Leslie Garfield, who's coming up. Leslie and Joe put together the most important collection of Grosvenor School linocuts in the world. Now they're at the Metropolitan Museum and would be preserved for all to see. I think we're so lucky to be able to see them at the Met, and I can't wait. So thank you. And now here's Leslie.
Okay, you can. No, I'm not here. Hi.
Hi, Les, do you want to say a few words about Nevinson's Blue Wave?
Sure. Am I on or?
We are on, and I thought maybe this is a print from your incredible collection, which will be on view in our exhibition. And it's such a striking, powerful work. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what attracted you to this work. Nevinson was slightly earlier than the Grosvenor, but as Gordon mentioned, he had strong connections likely with Claude Flight, or at least Flight would have known his work. So I wonder if you might say a few words about Blue Wave for us.
Well, the Wave is a print I had sought for a long time. And a dealer in London called me that he had located a copy that was going to be sold at a provincial British auction house. And he was going down the next day to look at the condition and was I still interested in? And I said, not only am I interested in it, but I want to pay you a commission if I secure it. And that started, I already had a relationship with him. He went over, he said, Leslie, I have to go now. And it was, the auction was taking place and he bid and I got it. And I've always admired the dynamism of this image. And it's called the Blue Wave, which was the first color print that Nevinson ever did. And I started doing some research. And this was Hiroshi, the Japanese woodblock printmaker, did a folio of 39 steps. I have it written somewhere to the top of the Japanese mountain, and it is almost like Nevinson's wish to do something like that, probably an experimental way, because most of the work he was doing then were black and white images of the war in Europe, which are fantastic pieces. This one was Hiroshi's image, which is one of the most famous woodblocks in Japanese etching works, had the waves coming down on 3 boats. This image does not have the 3 boats in it, and this is the originality of this great print. I see it at home and I love it. It's very important to me of all the prints I own.
In addition to the Nevinson prints, which are just an incredible collection of just the best impressions, you also collected many related, much related materials, such as books, letters, photographs, and reviews and other clippings. And you've mentioned that there's a great interest that you have, that the art is 50% and the other material, the reading, is also 50% from your appreciation of the art. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about this
That,
great library that you've also created.
okay. The reference library that I have at home is indispensable. There are in excess of 2,000 books that provide background information, and I use them when necessary. I'm interested in other fields of art, but the collection that I gave to the Metropolitan included 106 works by Nevinson, and I can break it down and tell you that 87 of them are prints, 5 of them are books, the ephemera of 14, photographs, letters, and drawings, and 3 images of early work, early drawings. But I look at this futuristic work and I'm almost mesmerized by looking at, but it is based on Hiroshige's Japanese print. And
it is a stunning work. I wonder if you might say a little bit about the role of dealers such as Mary, who I know you know well, and Gordon in exposure to artists such as the Grosvenor School and Nevinson. Were they influential in your discovery of their work, or was it museum exhibitions or books, would you say?
Yeah, I'll start with Mary because I think we bought our first Grosvenor School image about 1984 from her. And I bought many more images from her. And we used to go to London. I was involved with the British Museum, Stephen Koppel, and we went to exhibits and I met Gordon, and I bought work from him. So finding the right dealers, if they still have any of these works left, or have I depleted to an extent, many of them I don't know, but this is just outstanding.
On a related note, I wonder if we might bring in Gordon and Mary to talk about the importance of collectors such as Leslie, who are not only really building deep and rich collection of the artists, but also archival materials such as journals and letters when possible. So maybe if you could say a few words, and then of course with his generosity to the Met, where all this will be, publicly available.
I could start by saying that the role of the collectors is huge, because we need collectors to actually support the art and artists that we're interested in. And Leslie and Joe, it's just been so much fun to work with them also. The excitement of realizing we have something that they don't have in the collection, or who you're most eager to share a work of art with, is somebody who's kind of on board and just as excited as you are as the dealer. So the collectors play an incredible role. And many times they come before the museums. From my perspective with the Linocuts, it was really the private collectors forming the collections ahead of the museums, and then museum interest definitely followed. But we're had so much fun. And there are other wonderful collectors of Linocuts too, but that's one of the great joys. Gordon?
Yeah, I think the collectors have played a vital part, because I would show them in the gallery in London, and then I would show them at print fairs, particularly in New York, and that's where I met all the great collectors. That's where I met Leslie. Apart from London, Leslie's was at one fair, and he said, "What are you doing for dinner or lunch?" And we had dinner at the Regency, and we've been friends ever since. And whenever I had something really, really interesting, I would always send it to him and keep in touch. And I've done that with all the collectors and dealers from London to California to Australia and New Zealand. Looking at the blue wave, which is still on the screen, what is absolutely fascinating about this is that Nevinson was a consummate lithographer, and that this was made just a few short years after he learned how to make lithographs. I mean, the degree of skill is just amazing, just amazing.
I wonder if we might advance an image and think of the influence that Nevinson and the earlier generation, such as the Vortices, may have had on Claude Flight, who was of a slightly different generation than his students and his students at the Grosvenor School. Gordon, if you wanted to say a few words.
Yes, when Flight first went to Heatherley's School of Art, he was 31, and Nevinson was also a student there. But they would have known each other. I think Nevinson would have been, Flight would have been aware of Nevinson's sort of bombastic talk on supporting Marinetti in 1913. And I haven't got, there's no substantive proof that they knew each other. But they must have done, and he must have been very aware of Nevinson's work at the time. And I think when you look at the Grosvenor School works, it's almost certainly influenced by Cubism, by Vorticism, and I think Nevinson played quite a part in that. Flight's prints are much more abstracted than the other members of the Grosvenor School. This one I particularly like, of Breaking Waves.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the blue wave was reproduced in journals and the painting, of course. So it's highly likely that he would have perhaps seen that, especially with the keeping up. So I see that we are over time, but if anyone has any questions, this might be a good time. I don't know, Gordon, Mary, if you have any questions of each other or of Les, or less of Gordon and Mary. I guess one question that we might close out with is what you see as maybe the influence of the Grosvenor School. Do you see it having an influence, or do you think of it as a more contained unit? And something that I think we've touched on in all the talks, the whole symposia, is why the work, which is absolutely fantastic and so powerful and speaks so much of a period, as you mentioned, Frank Pick, as well as Mary, you mentioned labor, why the work is not better known outside of the print community, because it really is incredibly progressive and is, I believe, has been discussed that the group was roughly half women, so women made up a large component, but why it's not included in modernism books to a greater degree, or even books on British modernism. So I didn't know if people had thoughts about the legacy of the Grosvenor School.
I think, sorry, if I may, I think the importance of it was cemented by Anthony Griffiths and Francis Carey's catalogue in 1990, when there was a whole chapter on the Grosvenor School, and it's the seminal work on 20th century British prints called Avant-Garde British Printmaking, 1939 to 1960. I think same sort of dates as you're using at the Met. So, and then there was another Australian publication, which was at the Victoria Art Gallery of British painting. And again, there was a whole chapter on the prints. But it seems to be that the market has always been predominantly an Anglo-Saxon English-speaking buyer base in the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There's a huge collection in New Zealand that was donated by Rex Nancobel, I think back in the early 1950s. And there's only one major museum in Europe that I can think of, which is outside of Stuttgart, that show relief prints. But there was also a major exhibition in the Cobra Museum, I think in the late 90s, Amstelveen, is it? And again, there was a chapter on these Linocuts. So they were shown, but they really weren't picked up on. I mean, I've tried to show them in Japan because I think there was an affinity there, but it never really, I couldn't find a Japanese dealer who was interested enough because the market was at a certain level in Western, in the English-speaking world, and it was difficult for anybody else, like the Japanese or whoever, to come in at that sort of level. Mm-hmm. But maybe that has something to do with it.
How did the work sell when they were in the exhibitions that Flight organized that traveled around the world? Do you know anything about the international market outside of the United States and Canada? Because they did travel to China, some of the.
They did, and I think, as I said earlier, there was a couple who saw them in 1929, Mr. and Mrs. Pennant, who lived in Shanghai, and Shanghai, as you know, was one of the great cities of the world at that time. And they spoke to Flight and took the show back to Shanghai, and there was great critical praise for them. And of course, the three Australians, Evelyn Syme, Ethel Spowers, and Dorrit Black, were showing works from the Grosvenor School in their own cities in Australia. They would write to Flight and say, "Hey, Claude, what about a show at Melbourne Library? And can you get the gang to get it all together?" And so they would hand print 5 or whatever it happens to be, send them to Australia, and one of the 3 women there who would organize the show in their own city would put it all together. So I think that's how a lot of the work was disseminated.
I think, Jennifer, you asked about legacy. I think now it's really into the next generations will continue the work. I feel that there's so much to be done. And I think that museums often segregate work that's by artists who primarily prints. If these were paintings, they would be discussed in a very different light. So in a funny way, the medium is what makes them so fantastic. And it's probably what also holds them back from broader recognition. Hopefully that will change going forward. And this show is so important at the Met coming up. Well,
thank you. Thank you for a wonderful panel, everyone. It was incredibly thought-provoking, great stories. I want to thank David Tunick and Jenny Gibbs and Sherry Young of the IFPDA, who've just been incredibly supportive of this symposia, and as well as our fantastic panelists, Gordon Samuel, Mary Ryan, and Leslie Garfield. And I'll turn the camera over to Jenny Gibbs.
Thank you, Jennifer, Gordon, Mary, and Les. I wanted to remind folks to join us again on Wednesday. Gordon will be back with Jenny Uglow for a conversation about her upcoming publication, Sybil and Cyril, Cutting Through Time. Tomorrow we have Susan Tallman, art historian, writer, critic, co-founder of the journal Art and Print, and frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. Susan will be exploring some of the ideas posed by Rosalind Krauss in her famous 1979 essay, Sculpture in the Expanded Field, as they relate to prints. In particular, Krauss's claim that postmodern art could no longer be defined by material and is now organized instead through binaries like uniqueness and reproducibility. I'm really excited about this talk and hope that you can join us. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.